We're winging it again.
Winging again. Hi, folks. Tonight we are talking to Saskatchewan, or I think Regina-based artist David Garneau. And David works in drawing, painting, does performance, is a professor at the university there, I believe, and also does a lot of curatorial work and critical writing. So yeah, let's talk to David tonight. Hi,
hello,
David.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good. Welcome to Winging It.
Yes, welcome.
Can you hear me well enough?
We can, yeah.
Yes.
So just to start, I believe you're located, are you in Regina?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're Regina. Are you still teaching there? At
Yeah.
University? Yeah, okay.
Teach at the University of Regina.
Right.
And classes are still going on?
No, they've been done for probably.
Oh, right. It's May.
So.
Yes, I've completely lost track of time.
That's right.
I imagine, have you been here in Ontario? The universities have all been teaching virtually.
Yeah.
My son's an art student. He just finished his BFA program at Nipissing, and the entire year, all of his art classes were done virtual. Were yours all?
No, our senior classes were actually all the senior classes were face-to-face.
Oh, okay.
And some of the junior classes were one-on-one.
Okay.
So by clearing out the juniors, we had lots of space for all the seniors to social distance.
Oh, that's great. Right on. Yeah. I know it's been a struggle.
How one can teach or learn in a virtual environment in terms of art, visual art. I can't imagine a bigger challenge. It's one thing to be learning history or math that way, but and it's a struggle. But art, I can't imagine.
Yeah, we've been talking to a lot of artists here in Ontario who are teachers at the university level or at art college, and it's been really hard for them.
Yeah,
trying to do that.
The drawing I taught a junior drawing, an intro drawing class, and I didn't enjoy the experience as much, but the crits went better, and the results were as good, and in some cases better than previous years. So I was very surprised at the outcome. But there were a few who definitely fell through the cracks because they didn't get the usual kind of coaching you get to do one-on-one.
Right.
So good students do well, not so good students struggle. So
sure, and then everybody has a different relationship to this kind of online format. Some people seem to thrive, and others they need that in person. To feel inspired or to get it, right? Just to get it, right? Just a learning process.
Material, yeah.
So true.
So, we've been, Mark and I have been doing this, what do we call it? Webinar? No, what do we call these? Podcasts for about a year and a half, and of course the last year and 2 months on Zoom. One of the things we like to start with is how the pandemic is impacting you, and we've talked about it in terms of professionally, but just in terms of your life personally and your practice, your art practice.
So the pandemic hasn't been too challenging. Teaching wise, I was on sabbatical until a year ago. And so for the first part, while all the chaos was going on, I was sublimely working in my studio at home. I was working here in the studio at the university as well and had to move everything home, but that wasn't so bad. Teaching wise, some challenges. The senior classes and the graduate students were all face-to-face, so we're all masked up and it was annoying, but it went well. Seeing some of the chaos around and certainly a lot of friends who had exhibitions planned. I had a retrospective planned for the Nickel Arts Museum in Calgary, and that got delayed. So a little bit frustrating, but not compared to people who are dying.
Yeah, no.
Terribly sick. So,
yeah.
Looking at the comparison, no, it hasn't been too bad.
A lot of people live alone, just
so
isolation and
Yeah, so my mother-in-law, my partner's mother is 95, and she just moved in with us because of that, you know, concern about pandemic to some degree, but also the isolation and fear, because their building has frequently been in lockdown, and that wasn't much of a life. So it was nice that we moved into a big old house that has lots of room and for my adult kids and lovely mother-in-law. So it is nice to be able to share that with her and make things better.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful.
I guess the other thing I'm curious about, I do know one other Regina-based artist, Elizabeth Babin, who we've interviewed. What is there? What kind of art scene is there in Regina?
So most of the time I spend with the Indigenous artists across Canada, around the world. And so Sigewuwak is the Indigenous Arts Run Center. And we've gone through a bit of a chaotic time right at the moment. We're trying to pull that together. So that it's got a very grassroots type of relationship to the world. And then also some of those artists do engage beyond that, and we bring some of those artists in. There's some big changes. The Mackenzie Art Gallery has an Indigenous director. I think he's CEO/director, John Hampton, and other recent hires at the Film Board and at the Dunlop Art Gallery, and where else? I can't remember where else. I've been of color people, Black and well, actually both Black folks, and that's been really exciting. Often a place like this is thought to be maybe a little bit more conservative, and I'm surprised. And the thing is, everyone's doing such a good job. There hasn't been like a backlash, just an excitement of what's going to happen next and new artists coming in. So the city's got a thriving artist art scene, but also not shy about interacting through these galleries with folks elsewhere. So yeah, that part's exciting. But with the close down, I've seen that even when galleries have been open, the numbers are really small right now. So it's going to take a while to recover.
Sure. Yeah.
A lot of stuff shifted online. So last year I co-curated the Montreal Indigenous Biennale, and we were able to fill the galleries. There was a little opening in May, and we had 5 venues and more than 50 artists. And that was great, but the attendance was quite a bit down. So we had already planned for a lot of online events and did them, and that went very well. So I've been sort of a little shying away from those kinds of things, but after that success, I've been enjoying going to conferences, giving papers, that sort of thing through this format. It's been better than I expected. It's not the same, but I was able to give a talk through an institute, well, the Tate in London, but it was through something in Mexico City. And I don't think, even with the pandemic not going, I might not have been able to fly out because of teaching and so on. I travel a lot normally, and I've been trying to cut back, and to be able to still interact with these incredible people was great. So not the same, but sometimes really good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing we are discovering is, I mean, for example, you know, we wouldn't be doing a Zoom with you in Regina if the pandemic was on, because our original ideas, we were going to galleries and artist studios here in Toronto, right? And it's just because of the pandemic, and you know, we'd started using Zoom for other things. It's like, hey, why not? And no reason for it to not continue after, but it's really, you know, we've been interviewing artists from Mexico City, the UK, lots in the US, and all across Canada. So there's those opportunities. Mark and I are part of an arts collective. We just participated in TCAF, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, which was online this year. And you know, normally you go to the reference library, and there's, I don't know, 50, 100,000 people come in a weekend. It's hard to know what the actual attendance was this year,
but yeah, it does allows people to expand their parameters a bit in different ways. even as we're feeling squeezed or restricted in other ways. So yeah, I mean, I still can't wait to see all these things live.
Yeah, right, right.
Of,
And going to see the work in person.
Yeah.
We're talking with artists about using social media, and notice that artists are using more Instagram and Facebook. And you know, I spent a fair bit of time the past couple of days looking at your recent work on Facebook, and they translate well. I mean, obviously seeing them in person, but there's the perhaps the format and the way they're painted, they really kind of pop out and glow on the screen.
Yeah, that's worked out. I was posting them before the pandemic, partly as an incentive to keep going with a series that I was excited about but wasn't sure.
Right.
And my mission from years ago was to get things into the major collections, especially Métis or Indigenous content, because then they have to be used by curators and they have a different kind of life. And then thinking about Facebook and that, I thought, well, here's another way that's certainly more accessible to folks who can't get to the galleries. And so when the pandemic rolls around, it was kind of neat to just sort of continue that. And they're not huge. Some of them are large, but most of them are, you know, larger than screen size, but
right.
they accommodate well.
Less than a meter, less than a meter square.
Yeah, so you're not losing too much, but also it's a way of sort of passing around those ideas as I'm having them, and some of them correspond to, you know, events happening right at the time. So people are reading and projecting those meanings into them. And I found that kind of neat.
Are people exchanging ideas with you online, or are you exchanging ideas? Do you find that there's some kind of flow between other artists or other viewers in your own work?
Yeah, so they're getting a lot of feedback. And so when I realized that a content that I thought was kind of coy, or maybe people wouldn't get and they were getting, it was really exciting. Or if they were missing the boat but getting a better reading out of it, that really that happens quite a bit. I tend not to explain the work. You know, some of them I will, because there's some very obvious themes, but they might be lost without a little bit of direction. Mm-hmm. So that's led to some conversations and surprising ones. You know, if I'm on another chat or something and someone talks about having seen them and then they want to ask a question, or yeah, so it's been really engaging. I would like in the future, this one Dylan Robinson, who's out of Queen's University, and I were talking about him composing. He works with music and thinking about instruments or things other than books on rocks and skull.
Right.
And then getting a bit of a dialogue. Years ago, John Hall did a wonderful series, I'd say somewhere in the 80s.
Right.
Matthew Towsley curated them for the Glenbow Museum, and they were self-portraits of his friends through their objects. And I really like that series. So I can imagine sort of passing that curatorial authority or artistic authority to somebody else to come up with ideas. But I'm not until I get bored of my own ideas.
I wanted to talk a bit about this series because I find it interesting because you're using a very traditional format, the still life, European, with hundreds of years of tradition, and you know that also gets represented in the books and that kind of the institutions of learning. But then there's rocks or indigenous tools, it looks like. Yeah, I wonder if you can talk about, you know, I mean, you don't have to give away the meanings, but sort of where that's coming from.
Yeah, so I love painting, and I love realistic or representational. I like all kinds of painting, but particularly representational painting. And I like that on the ontological scale in the academy, the still life was at the bottom. And so it was available to folks who couldn't access, you know, the academy system, the new model.
Right. Oh, okay.
So a lot of outsider people, and particularly women, worked in that mode. And so I thought, yeah, here's something I could enter into that is sort of a desktop level where I could produce one idea after another rather than working on big machines, you know, big history paintings, the way some other artists are working very well. And so I could do my own way.
Someone like Kent Monkman or
Kent Monkman especially. And I've done large paintings, and I've got a Louis Riel on horseback that's like 8 feet high. And I like these where I can get some very subtle, small, almost domestic tabletop ideas out that have larger implications. But I also like that still life paintings, are open to a lot of readings rather than the sort of one-liners of some of the big machines. And I thought, you know, an artist like Morandi and Chardin, Cézanne, they just resonate in my mind forever. You know, I can never get bored of that kind of work. And then it's a challenge to make them interesting one after the other. So the content, though, the way they're produced is I have the idea. Sometimes I just put things together and try and figure out a meaning later. But more often I have a particular idea in mind that I'm trying to illustrate. And so they're metonymies, they stand in for other things. So the rocks, I have rocks of various sorts. So this one, it's hard to see anything special, but there's some red pigment and ochre in there. And this was a gaming stone found on the prairies that were used in play. And then they would be, other stones would be carved. So this is a pounding stone.
Right, yeah. I've seen that one in the painting, yeah.
Yeah. And then if they're wrapped this way, this is you know, probably a domestic item, but could be used in warfare, I suppose. And to me, the objects have a very particular resonance. So I'm interested in the ontology of these objects. So in European sense, as in Indigenous sense, the object that is found in nature is called a rock, and a Sini in Cree, for instance. But it's a stone if it's conceptualized or in human use. So that when it's wrapped up, or a gaming stone or a pounding stone, even in geology, we call it a stone versus a rock. They're two different things, even though they're the exact same thing.
That's right. I always wondered about the classification. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that too. You know, Arthur Danto, a wonderful artist, philosopher, talked about what's the difference between a mere real thing and a work of art. And it's a similar problem, right? And so when we invest it with meaning, it gets elevated in a certain way.
Sure.
And from an Indigenous point of view, they have an elevation all their own that we sort of access or don't access depending our level of ignorance. So I'm interested in those plays. And then, so the stones normally stand for Indigenous knowledge, and they're called grandfathers in culture. And there's a tension, for instance, between books or the university or academics. Those are what the books normally represent.
Right, yeah.
And the stones, so Indigenous land knowledge. And so they're often in tension. But at the same time, so there's a couple of tensions. One is that a lot of Indigenous folks don't want their stories and thoughts recorded, because if they're recorded, then they don't need to exist anymore. You've got the record. But then the record is fixed and not discursive the way that kind of knowledge is. And then if you don't record it and it doesn't get passed on to the next generation of Indigenous folks, it might be lost. So there are Indigenous elders who are sort of against the recording through a book, and yet other ones that see its necessity, and it goes back and forth.
Right.
So
how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So in these books, there's or these paintings, there's all kinds of suggestions. So if you've got a book with a rock tethered to it, it could represent like, well, this is my source. So in the Indigenous academe, you cite your sources that include how you got your knowledge from elders, and so you cite that elder. So there's all kinds of plays like that isn't about either or, but how these two get along. So similarly, there'll be a painting of a hammer and an Indigenous hammer.
Indigenous hammer thing,
Yeah, and so I think that one's called Complementary Methodologies. So the notion that sometimes you need one kind of tool, sometimes you need another, depending on the context or use. So that's the main theme for quite a lot of them.
I was looking at one today, which I found humorous. I'm assuming it's meant to be humorous.
Oh yeah, most of them are.
Non-metaphorical still life with trout or something like that.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at some of them, and you know, you go, okay, there's a metaphor here. There is some sort of, and then there's this one that just.
Yeah, sometimes a trout is just a trout.
Yeah.
And in that case, you know, I saw that trout in.
Worked in acrylic for 35 years, and I have worked in oil, but they're definitely different. I guess it's like recording in analog or recording in digital. There's a certain. I think of acrylic as a digital medium and oil as analog, just because it's so much more sensuous. But then with acrylic, it dries faster.
Yeah.
And
and with oils, you can get layers and have layers of color and luminescence coming out, which I couldn't. I mean, I used to work in oils, and I gave up on acrylics once I found oils. I couldn't go back.
Yeah.
Actually, now I haven't painted in a while. I work primarily with pen and ink, but if I do go back to painting, it will probably be acrylics, only because I'm now used to that kind of approach where it's just where you don't want multiple layers, where I like things flat and simple black and white is what I work in now, and I would probably work similarly in acrylic if I go there.
But you can't do many layers with the acrylic. When I first looked at those pieces, David, I thought they were watercolor because there's such a subtle modulation of
which is not an effect I was ever able to get out of my acrylic work. Yeah.
Well, that's nice you should mention that, because I've been playing with, on other larger paintings on canvas, particularly very, very thin layers of color in acrylic, and almost like comic book. Well, they were comic book quilt paintings, these ones. Okay. And what I found here is, unlike oils where you can't sort of finish with that sort of watercolor effect you can with acrylics, they'll still bond. Mm-hmm. And so playing with things where some of them have almost like a stucco texture next to something very thin, and sometimes the stucco is in the foreground, sometimes the background. And so I'm really interested in playing with the literal layers, but also the pictorial space layers. It's just been so much fun. And so
play
when
with
you've got a subject where you're coming back to that same shallow space all the time, you have to, in order not to get bored, you keep trying to something new. So that's been the best part.
Well, acrylic has all these mediums that you can mix in. So I
Yeah.
play with those. Yeah.
I don't use the extended mediums. I've used open acrylics for certain things,
Okay.
like especially laying down backgrounds if I don't want them to get too blocky, so a white, but I'm trying not to, because then otherwise why not just finish with oils?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want that kind of fake oil
Yeah.
look. Yeah.
So if we could just go back maybe to the themes and content of your work, with the still lifes, you were describing a kind of an interface between two different types of traditions, Western and Indigenous, and it sounded like there was the goal was a kind of a reconciliation, or at least a meeting together of these different kinds of traditions of perception and traditions of knowledge, and how to carry knowledge from generation to generation. Some of your other works, I'm thinking of your collages and perhaps your series, Cowboys and Indians. There, the interface does, tell me if it is, if I'm wrong. It doesn't, I don't get a sense of a reconciliation going on, but maybe more of a critique or a commentary of one against another. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, the constant theme is ambivalence, right? So as a primarily white passing guy, raised in Edmonton, I've always had both things there, sort of Indigenous culture on one side, but the dominant culture is the one I was mostly absorbed into and appreciate it. And that's the terrible thing. If you learn a real good skill like painting, and then you're trying to work on the Indigenous stuff, it's so painful to leave the skill you've worked on so hard behind. So a lot of the first work was ironic, like look at this funny thing, or this is ridiculous, or whatever. So I tried to shift probably 10 years ago or so to a more maybe sincere practice. And so probably, yeah, I'm trying to date it, probably 2006 or so, I was looking for a means of bringing Métis culture, say beading or other kinds of work, into a contemporary way. And I hadn't seen Christy Belcourt's work, but I ended up coming up with the same solution of these sort of dot beaded things. And then she was working with a very flat way, like a decorative way. And I decided that I wouldn't go the same way, but I decided to use the sort of Western illusionistic space and then the grid of beads on top to talk about this interplay, or how one thing's a screen for the other. I've done other kinds of work. As I say, this big bridge project has 400 paintings that'll be installed in August on the ceiling of the bridge. And they're as small as, well, there's probably, I don't know, probably 1,000 paintings altogether, but there's some of them are just very small, but the other ones are like 21 feet long. And there I've got a more concerted effort of trying to come up with a Métis decorative style. And I think I've achieved that, but there's still a lot of so-called Western or illusionistic painting in there. But the Cowboys and Indians and Métis was a real struggle to find a visuality for Métis identity, aside from, sashes and all the usual stuff.
Sure.
And that's a struggle, because it's also a struggle I've been working lately on the Bridge project and another project with Cree people, and often the visual imaginary is sort of rested in the mid 1800s. And trying to find ways to be contemporary is what a lot of Indigenous artists are struggling to come up with.
Right.
Some of the best solutions are in material culture, so in beading and fashion, and and performance art. There's some incredible work going on. Less so in painting. There's some, but it's not great.
Like you go to Carl Beam and Jane Patra, using the abstract expressionism, and then of course here in Ontario, Norval Morrisseau created his own style, but now it's replicated by 1,000 other artists.
Yeah, so like Jane Ash and Carl Beam and John Cardinal Schubert, all working in Alberta. At least Carl went to school at the U of A at that time. Their main solution was the collage. And that was the same thing as me. I'm coming a little bit later and certainly was mentored by Joan Cardinal Schubert. But the idea was to bring in multiple sources to then the viewer has to put some of these things together as best they can and get a sense. But folks who know the meanings, the Indigenous folks particularly, they would get all the signals and triggers.
Right.
But someone like Joan would stand before a painting and be able to explain all the different stuff. And but it allowed a great more complexity than working with historical culture as a less ironic way. And
well, and then just aesthetically and as an art form, they were very exciting.
Yeah,
all
definitely.
The different colors, all the colliding imagery, painted, photographic, almost like a Rauschenberg kind of.
Yeah.
You know.
And it definitely comes from Rauschenberg, who was supposedly part Indian. And but I mean, Jane Ash and Joan took that seriously and said, yeah, he's a kindred spirit, and this is an Indigenous way. And he and others were ripping off Navajo blankets and so on. And the sand paintings, Pollock had a direct line, recognized his work as inspired by that sand painting tradition. But also even in Copper Thunderbird, in Nova Morrisseau's style, it also took in multiple sources, you know, his Christian sources, not just from his shaman sources, and also he was in Ekankar and all these things. So the idea that he could bring all these complex influences through this one thing and not, it looks traditional from one point of view, but wasn't.
Oh yeah, I mean, he invented that style, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, there was precedences that he tapped into in terms of rock art and bark painting, but certainly bringing it in. If there wasn't comic books and Picasso and modernism, he wouldn't have come up with that too.
Right, exactly. He was.
I wouldn't call it a reconciliation. I've written about this stuff before, but reconciliation assumes that people were reconciled before and then something fell apart.
Right.
This is mostly adversarial. These artists. Yeah, I don't see it as reconciliation. But what I find is I think we're humbled before the practice, right? So painters are painters, you know, carvers are carvers. There's a universal aspect to that. What we carve, what we mean, how we do it will be different, but there's a certainly appreciation across cultures, and I find that leads to a conciliatory environment if you're not afraid to go into those spaces and address that work.
What draws you to realism? You are an exquisite realist painter, extraordinary. I mean, the skill and technique just is mind blowing to me, and extremely attractive. In addition to the themes and the subject matter within, but what draws you to that? Because instantly you're twigging onto a tradition that has, you know, roots back to, you know, the Renaissance and Greek and Roman and all of that, and yeah, what takes you there?
Just generally, I mean, I'm an analytical thinker, and I'm not really a scholar, but I do a lot of scholarly writing, and it's very painful because I want sentences to be beautiful and perfect, and there's just an analytic cast of mind. Certainly in art school, I tried expressive work, and it just didn't give me any kind of pleasure. So for me, something that is kind of a perfect realization a set of ideas I have that, and yet they sort of you get something, and then when you look at 3 other paintings later, you realize, oh, maybe he was thinking about this, or look at these 2 paintings, look almost the same, the titles are totally different, and how do I, you know, they're like an essay that way, and that there's a sense of pleasure in the craft, you know, a display of skill, but also a problem solving. How do I get this effect? And like, I remember seeing John Hall, like I love John Hall. I'm not really a photorealist, but
Right.
John Hall's rocks looked like chocolate and they bothered me. And then I started painting and I think, holy shit, this is really hard. And so I had to develop new techniques to make the rocks look convincing, right? And so I thought, okay, I'm in dialogue with John Hall, or I'm in dialogue with Chardin. You know, how did Chardin fade that edge off? And you go see it, and it's not at all what I thought it was. You know, I was in the Louvre looking at these paintings, and what? It's so thin, or whatever.
Right,
you know,
yeah. Or you see like the lines, when the pencil lines are left in, and like in Chagall, you know, you see a lot of pencil lines.
I can't tell you how many times a guard has told me I have to look at a painting right up close.
Yeah, exactly.
Constantly obsessing over their technique, and how many times guards have, I'm sorry, sir, you have to step back.
Yeah.
Please stop.
That talks to this, and we were talking to John Kissick last week about you have to see work in person.
Yeah.
To get like the real impact of it and the energy of it.
Yeah.
And that was a challenge for me with acrylic painting, because acrylic can often look good in a photo or from a distance, and then sometimes it's dry and flat up close. So how do we solve that? Those are problems that I want to solve as well. So part of it is I wouldn't call it perfectionism, but it's a desire to solve complex problems and come up with elegant solutions, and take that mastery from one painting to the other. And every painting tries to do something different technically. So not only in content. So they're developed, these still lifes are developed very differently. So I conceptualize the idea, or I'm playing with objects, and by playing with them, a new idea emerges. I take a photograph, I transfer, well, I edit them. So out of 100, you know, maybe 10 might survive the editing process if I'm lucky. Then I'll draw them onto the panels, or, you know, sort of compose them, draw them on the panels. I might go back and reshoot if something's off, and then I'm painting them. And so each step is very, very different. And actually, the very end, I'm titling them. Usually I have the titles pretty close in mind, but I might get some surprises. But each one is a very different operation. And I'm interested in that. You know, I used to do a lot of critical writing and talk to artists, and I really was intrigued by people who thought totally different from me. So an example that a good friend of that period in the 90s was John Cotman, who was a big expressionistic guy. And first time I met him was in Halifax in '85. He was a visiting artist there, and he had a bottle of Jack Daniels. He had this giant painting. It was like 15, 20 feet high. And he had a 10-foot pole with a brush on it and paint on the floor. And he says, "What do you think this painting's about, Dave?" And I said, I don't know. He says it's about anger. And I said, "Really? You were angry the whole time? Like every stroke you were angry?" Oh, well, no, not really. But, and so what I was interested in was how he doesn't have to be angry to get each stroke, but he has to learn what an angry stroke is. And so sometimes they're felt, but usually there's a style that develops. It's a translation. It's like making sounds in a trumpet or a guitar. You don't have to be sad and happy all the time, you know. So Don Cotman and I were teaching at the Alberta College of Art and Design. I was there for five and a half years in the, let's see, 94 to 99, something like that. Right. And we were pretty good friends, but we're really opposite. So he's this expressive guy and energy and third, fourth generation out of the 1950s American style expressionist. And but he would often have me in for crits because I'm more analytic and interested in semiotics or whatever. And so when it came to painting, I tried that way because I admired, you know, when a person would work that way, they might have to do 20 paintings to get one great one, but it would be so great. I'd be so blown away. I just couldn't believe it. So I tried my hand in that. It just didn't work. It's too frustrating. It didn't give me any pleasure at all.
Sort of that expressionistic,
Yeah,
flowing. Yeah.
any of that. Ugh,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
But I love looking at it.
Yeah.
The difficulty is that if you're representationally inclined or conceptually inclined, you can make something that looks like an illustration, and you're most likely to make kitsch, you know, something that's well worn and understood.
Right.
And to innovate in that area can be really challenging.
Yeah.
And on the other side, if you're an abstract or non-objective painter, you could be stuck in decoration, you know, making lots of decorations, and your whole thing is trying to find a signature style. Those are the challenges. And there are artists who just keep hacking away at it and come up with solutions, and they're miracle workers in any field.
Yeah.
But for me, the other challenge is, what does the world need?
Yeah.
You know, there's a hell of a lot of paintings out there. And so this conceptual side is signal to me, you know, so I can express ideas that are germane more to my own subjectivity. In fact, I don't want to say none of the work I've made ever is autobiographical, but very few of it is, until these still life paintings. These still life paintings are probably the most autobiographical I've ever gotten. And yet you don't know anything about me from them, not much anyways.
Well, they're intimate though. They're intimate because they're small, and the you know, the objects are close. There's only a few of them, so there's a certain intimacy there.
Yeah. So you know, my critical hat says everything I just said is not true. You know, because Don Cotman is this extroverted guy. I used to call him the He-Man School of Fine Arts. Big paintings and just so much exuberance and energy, and that's his personality. My personality is trying to get things understood and making difficult things comprehensible in a simple way, but also Occam's razor, cutting out everything that doesn't necessarily need to be there. It has to be perfect's not the right word, because I'm not striving for perfection. But I identify with ceramics a lot, and a brilliant potter who throws the perfect bowl. You know, I just love that. And that happens in painting and stuff all the time.
Well, there's an economy of means and instead of it, like something exquisite and Zen-like about it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely Zen-like. So my personality is very even-tempered. And so most of these objects are about balance, but not balancing impossibilities. They often rely on symmetry, but with things tilted slightly or not quite right or off a little or something, and then they're counterbalanced by a bit more yellow here and red there. Or I really like playing with those very tight things. And I learned that, you know, from Cubism, when Picasso and Braque made this incredible innovation, you know, world changing really, they had to go to the most pathetic form, which is still life, in order to do it. Still life and landscape. But they had to go to that place that is neglected, but also the site of incredible innovation in order to make it happen. And then they had to bleach out their colors, right? Because it was called analytic for a reason.
Yeah.
Leave Juan Gris and others to do the emotive cubism, but they were on an analytic path. It only lasted a few years, but what a moment. And so I went to still life for the same reason. You know, it's neglected. Who shows still life paintings? So I'm trying to make them so that you'd care. So now I've got more than 100, and there'll be a show that'll tour at some point and try and make people care about still life painting again.
Well, the interesting thing about them is, so they're each, a stripped down kind of scene, but taken together, there's this, they're a saga. They're a saga. There's it's a book. It's a
narrative in a sense.
A narrative.
It really is. And so the years they're produced is important. So there's a set there that are about Black Lives Matter. There are ones that are, you know, very particular struggles in Indigenous community with people recently being outed as not being Indigenous. And so I've made one piece that I don't think I've got it framed or photographed yet, that's about that. And there's a number of things like that. And so there's going to be a book, and what'll happen is there'll be, you know, 100 paintings available for these authors to then respond to. And then they're going to write poetry or a text to go with them. And they might be, you know, an ekphrasis, you know, like a description, or it might be something triggers their thoughts or wherever it goes. And I'm really interested in that play between these two different medias.
Love that idea.
Yeah. So
you have a little series that's kind of like still life, but not fully, about that involves roadkill or images of roadkill.
there are still life though. And one of them.
Well, that's it. They have us. They're like still life, right? But are they? But there's something more to it than that, right?
One of them was literally called Stilled Life.
Still.
So
Yes.
I've had my heart's desire was to present these at some kind of you know, wildlife exhibition. That's still on my bucket list. I made these I think it was about 14 or 15 years ago, and they're so there's so many things happening. So one is I have ambivalence about everything, but there's a big tension between abstraction and representation for me. So I'm sort of anti-formalist, and yet I use formalist methodology all the time. Like a lot of these compositions are very inspired by formalist paintings. There are two of the large roadkills that are off of abstract expressionist painters. And then there are a bunch of smaller ones that they start off in realism, and then these are drive-by paintings. Sometimes they have birds, sometimes not. And then below, suddenly you'll see an abstract expression as a Pollock or whatever, or different painters in there, Rothko especially. Yeah. And a lot of these were taken in drives up Tama Lake when that was open. And I went there a couple of times, and the artists were still enthralled with modernism, and I just was, it was catchy, and I got it. So a lot of those paintings are playing on abstraction and representation. They're quite abstracted. None of them are sentimental. I think there might be one with a head in it, but mostly they're not. Right. So that you have to contemplate the form rather than the object. But also they're artificial. They're clearly, no one set up an easel in front of the stinking carcass. So the photo base is really important. Some are composite. There's one that has, I took photographs as I walked around the bird and then tried to get all those elements into the painting. So there's a number of things going on. Again, there's a series around that time, but including those ones that had a spiritual dimension that I didn't recognize at first, certainly because I was seeing all these animals as I was driving around. And at that time, I was looking for Métis sites and talking to elders and this sort of thing along the Yellowhead Highway, the Carleton Trail. But a colleague of mine, Gail Chin, who's looking at Japanese Zen paintings particularly, showed me this series of scrolls where a junior Zen kid would be brought in, look at these scrolls, and they show a desiccating corpse. And you were to identify with that body and yet know that that's going to happen to your body, but also that you're more than that body. So that was an element. But a funny story, I brought these paintings. They went on a tour of Saskatchewan maybe 12, 13 years ago. And they went up to on a school in a white community, but next to a reserve in northwest Saskatchewan. I think it was at Carrot River, but I can't recall. And so I was honored by, sort of a powwow demonstration and a pipe ceremony and this sort of thing. And then I was showing my slide strokes, trying to explain what I was doing. And one of the guys said, First Nations guy said, so you don't see this as part of your Indigenous heritage? And I said, not really. It's just, sometimes you're just driven to try something. You don't know what it's going to be. And he says, well, let me see if I got this straight. He said, so you drive up and down the Yellowhead Highway and you take photos of roadkill, you go to your studio, you stretch a canvas, you paint it, and you try and sell them. I said, okay, yeah, pretty much. And he says, well, that's your trap line. And it blew my mind, right?
Yeah.
And it blew my mind because, you know, I've always been interested in every step of art, including, you know, getting the sources, the theory, the whatever, the making the thing, but also selling. You know, I'm not against selling art. And certainly when I'm in Indigenous company, they want to know, do you sell them or do you make any money off them? And yeah, I do, or no, I don't, or maybe I will, or whatever. And so they were fascinated that you could actually make a living off of roadkill. And that's also what happens in other Indigenous art forms, you know, in terms of quill work or something.
Yeah, that's why I use porcupine quills and stuff.
Yeah, so for me, that's all part of the same. So sometimes I don't think I'm doing Indigenous work, and then Indigenous people find a way that has meaning within their understanding, and so that's a real delight.
As you were talking, I was reminded of another body of work you did, and I'm not sure what the title is, but they had a square that was sort of kind of flat in the middle. I don't know, were they the periphery paintings, or is that what they were called?
Yeah, peripheral painting.
Peripheral. Those were very interesting because you know, it's kind of
they're kind of abstract.
Late modernism with the flat color field painting, but then representation, something's being superimposed, or it's interesting.
So when I moved to Regina, you know, I was trying to cobble together a living when I was living in Alberta as a writer, and a little bit of teaching at the Alberta College of Art and Design and all of this. But when I got here and got this big studio that they give us, I was finally able to try everything. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And those came to mind. So again, they're about that tension between abstraction and representation, but also the anxiety about beauty. So each one of them, the backgrounds are beautiful scenes or horrific scenes, but they're all blanked out by this great big square that you can sort of read into. And sometimes there's some shapes in there, kind of like a Chris Cran, where there's something happening in there. But really it's a transitional work. And what I was wrestling with was whether I was going to make a Métis art or engage Indigenous work before coming here. So that's in '99. I was making this very large comic book painting. It's about 26 by maybe 6 feet. I can't remember. It's all in the Glenbow collection.
Yeah.
So that one was called How the West Was ... And so I was engaging the themes of colonialism and indigeneity at that time, and I wasn't sure what where would go, and I was doing collage work. And so this was a transition set of paintings. And I haven't revisited them, but I have a soft spot in my head for them. For me, I need something else. And so that period was wrestling with, and I don't think that they were, the edges were beautiful, but the interiors they weren't invested in the way that Jonathan Forrest would have, say, layered that up or poured gel and just, you know, be beautiful.
Sure.
So it was a fully ironic painting. And as I say, it wasn't until I really got into trying to bring Métis culture and craft into painting that I got into a more sincere mode, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
You did, to kind of recap, you've described a journey from more ironic kind of approach to painting to more sincere.
Yeah.
Where do you see yourself heading? Into more sincerity, or do you have another direction that you might see yourself heading? Yeah,
so Insincere Art, not as a judgment, but as a quality, is when someone's saying something that they don't mean, right?
Right.
And if you're making something where there's no meaning, that to me is insincere as well, but it also could be sincere, you know, you could be vacant. And so sincere art is meaning that you are representing something without irony. And someone like Jeff Koons says that he's a sincere artist, and like Warhol, that he just loves these kitschy things. And I suppose I believe him, but I find it difficult to really believe him. I think he does what people like, and I love some of them. Yeah. So for me, it's a struggle, always looking for both moments of sincerity and irony that are useful, you know. So in the language of metaphors, where you get that. So I'm painting something that is sincerely a rock, it's sincerely a book, or whatever the object is. I'm absolutely, at that moment of painting, focusing on that object and trying to get it right and make it beautiful and work within the harmonies or whatever. And so that is completely sincere. But when I'm composing originally or coming up with the idea, I might be playing on some kind of irony. But a metaphor is always both sincere and insincere. A metaphor is saying that there's a relationship between things that don't have a relationship. So you can't be sincere, but they rhyme in some significant way. And so it's a sincere effort.
The leap is made in our thinking process.
Yeah. And it's not just a projection. It's there. It's when the intent rhymes with the reading that something really beautiful happens. So that's what I'm engaged in. So the subject matters will change, the formats will change, but that essential search is a constant.
You mentioned the bridge in Edmonton. When do you see that project? It sounds like you've been working on it for a few years. And
yeah, the paintings are all done.
Okay.
I designed them all and painted about half myself, but I had a team of about 12 artists or more. And so the work's been done for 2 years. There's still some smaller pieces we're working on, but it'll be installed this summer in July or August. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And that's a good example where, you know, that's definitely non-autobiographical or not emotional. There's subject matters that were in part, well, determined by conversations with Métis and First Nations, Cree people in the area, and a few non-Indigenous folks. And so it's about doing something meaningful and beautiful, but still lots of irony and play and tricks and hidden messages and things like that.
Nice.
And the way I'm working too there, and that's where I learned not to talk too much about the paintings, is because the stories are mostly, not all, but many of them are Indigenous stories from the region. I'll be walking through a couple of times in the fall with elders. They'll explain, and knowledge keepers, they'll explain all the stories, and nothing will ever be recorded, so that you'll have to go there and have that knowledge passed down from somebody who owns it. So I'm really excited by how that works in a very different way than I would normally work.
How does that, so obviously this bridge project is a collaboration, and how does that compare with, you know, obviously the work you do in your studio is solo, and yeah, just how do you find
how is collaborating
in a collaborative process?
Yeah, so I'm very picky about my language, and I'm very use the word collaboration not loosely. So collaboration is when two people come together more or less as equals,
right? And
they do some third new thing that transforms both those two people and their practice. And if that happens, then you've got a collaboration. If you've got two artists working on the same canvas and you see both their styles, or they homogenize themselves or something, but not a new third thing hasn't been made, to me, it's not a collaboration. And for me, I was the boss.
Okay.
They were my employees.
Okay.
And if they didn't do it right, I would repaint it. You know, I told them what to do and they did it. So they were certainly working with me and did substantial work, and many paintings are, well, I designed them and whatever, they did them themselves, but they also suppressed their style towards a style that was compatible with each other. There are some things that clash. There's some graffiti things that resonate, but they're not it's not all one hand. You would never mistake it for that. But there's a limited palette so that things sort of unify.
So it's kind of a classic European master and students.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's no question. So that's why I shy away from calling it collaboration.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Right.
I can rarely lose my analytic side enough to collaborate with people.
I guess I was thinking more of the stories.
Yeah. So it's a very good point. So those were cases where, so what would happen was, you know, I'd be talking with Jerry Saddleback, the main elder that I was working with, and he would say, "Oh yeah, you know, do this, that," and I would do the thing, and he'd look at it and says, "Oh, okay, now I see what you're doing. Now, if you could take that, and now I can tell you another story, and then let's see what you do with that." So I do that one, and he'd say, "Okay, now you're ready for this," or then he would tell me more of a story.
Okay.
So that was collaborative because he had a story and a set of concepts and teachings to go with it. I had some skills. And so I suppressed my desire of getting my concepts in there, and he put his, but he couldn't visualize them. And so we came up with this third thing that was neither his nor mine.
Right. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
and those things don't look like anything else I've ever done. They bear no relationship to my style. I mean, there's color choices and technical things for sure, but that's a collaboration. Absolutely. I collaborate almost exclusively when I'm curating for the last 6 years. I've worked with an Indigenous female curator in the show in Australia and New York, and also in Montreal recently, or here in Regina. So the last 6 years, those are true collaborations where we come up with something that we wouldn't have come up with otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
But mostly, yeah. So in the studio, though, when I'm making these small pieces, they're exclusively this person, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I love now at this more senior level that I can do multiple things and feel comfortable in each one, or stretched in a different way, but I'm not going to lose myself. Or so, yeah, it's a nice place in my life to be.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, we should probably bid you adieu. It's been a great chatting with you and hearing about your work and your process. And
Well, I thank you too, Marc and Charles, for having me. It was a wonderful chance to speak.
Yeah,
all right.
Very much.
Right.
It's been great.
Okay.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye
Bye-bye.
now.